The season had begun with its usual fever of expectation, though for Sebastian Harcourt, Marquess of Thornbury, it brought only the tedium of obligation. He stood at the edge of the Bellingham's ballroom, a glass of champagne held loosely in one hand, watching the dancers whirl past in a blur of silk and candlelight. At 32, he had mastered the art of appearing engaged whilst remaining entirely detached, a necessary skill for a man of his position, wealth, and temperament. His reputation preceded him wherever he went. Cold, they called him, brilliant in matters of estate and politics, ruthless in business, and utterly uninterested in the marital machinations that drove the ton into a frenzy each spring. He had inherited his title at 21 upon his father's death, and had spent the subsequent decade building the Thornbury fortune into something formidable. Women pursued him with transparent desperation. Mothers positioned their daughters in his path with military precision. He evaded them all with the same cool courtesy that never quite reached his eyes. Tonight, however, Sebastian found his attention caught, not by design, but by accident. She stood across the room in conversation with Lady Pemberton, her profile illuminated by the warm glow of 100 candles. There was nothing particularly remarkable about her at first glance. Dark hair arranged simply, a gown of cream silk that spoke of taste rather than ostentation, posture that suggested breeding without arrogance. Yet something in the way she held herself, in the quiet animation of her expression as she listened to her companion, drew his gaze and held it longer than he intended. "That," said a voice beside him, "is Miss Eleanor Ashworth, returned from 3 years abroad." Sebastian turned to find his cousin, Lord Philip Harcourt, grinning with the particular satisfaction of a man about to impart gossip. "I am not interested in the returning debutantes, Philip," Sebastian replied, though his eyes drifted back toward the woman in question. "She is hardly a debutante. 28, if memory serves, accompanied her father to Italy after her mother's death. He was a diplomat, you know. She speaks 4 languages fluently, or so it is said. Reads Latin like you or I might read the morning papers." Sebastian felt a flicker of something he could not quite name. Curiosity, perhaps, or the faint stirring of interest where there had long been only indifference. "She will be seeking a husband, then," he said, his tone dismissive. "On the contrary, rumour suggests she returned only because her father died 6 months ago. She has her own income, modest but sufficient, and a cottage in Kent. Lady Pemberton has been trying to launch her back into society, but Miss Ashworth appears singularly uninterested in matrimony." Before Sebastian could respond, Lady Pemberton herself approached, Miss Ashworth at her side. His cousin melted away with suspicious speed, leaving Sebastian no choice but to acknowledge the introduction. "Lord Thornbury, may I present Miss Eleanor Ashworth? She has recently returned from Florence and is quite the most accomplished young woman of my acquaintance." Sebastian bowed with practiced precision. "Miss Ashworth." "Lord Thornbury." Her voice was low, controlled, with the faintest trace of warmth beneath its formality. When she met his gaze, her eyes, grey, he noticed, like winter light on water, held neither the coy calculation he had come to expect from unmarried women, nor the nervous deference his title usually commanded. She looked at him as one might regard an interesting painting, with attention, but without personal investment. "Lady Pemberton has been exceedingly kind," Miss Ashworth continued, "though I confess I find London much changed from what I remember." 3 years is a considerable time," Sebastian replied, aware that he was engaging more fully than he had intended. "Florence, your ladyship mentioned? I trust you. Found Italy agreeable." Something flickered across her features. Pain quickly mastered. "My father's health required a warmer climate. We found much to appreciate, though the circumstances were often difficult." Lady Pemberton, sensing perhaps that the conversation had taken a sombre turn, inserted herself with maternal determination. "Miss Ashworth has the most wonderful eye for art, Lord Thornbury. You must hear her speak of the galleries. I'm certain you would find it most enlightening." I'm sure I would," Sebastian said, the words more automatic than sincere. Yet when he looked at Miss Ashworth again, he found himself genuinely curious. "Are you much interested in art yourself, Miss Ashworth?" "I find it offers truths that words cannot," she replied quietly. The Renaissance masters understood that emotion could be captured in colour and shadow, in the turn of a hand, or the weight of a gaze. Language, for all its precision, sometimes fails us. Sebastian felt something shift in his chest, a recognition perhaps of a kindred isolation. How many times had he stood before a turner or a constable and felt more understood than in any conversation he had endured in a London drawing room? "And do you paint yourself?" he asked, aware that the question was more personal than their brief acquaintance warranted. "I sketch occasionally. Nothing of consequence." She paused, and he saw the slightest hesitation before she spoke again. "I find I am better at observing than creating." There is a certain safety in distance, is there not? The observation struck him with unexpected force. Safety in distance. It was a philosophy he had lived by for more than a decade, since the night his mother had died, giving birth to a stillborn child, since his father had retreated into grief so profound. It had consumed what remained of his life within the year. Sebastian had learned then that love was dangerous, that attachment brought only devastation. He had built his existence around that principle, and here was a woman who seemed, in her quiet way, to have reached the same conclusion. "Indeed," he said softly, "though I wonder if safety is worth the price we pay for it." Eleanor Ashworth looked at him then with an intensity that made him acutely aware of the space between them, of the noise of the ballroom fading to insignificance. For a moment, neither spoke. Then Lady Pemberton, oblivious to the current that had passed between them, declared she must introduce Miss Ashworth to Lady Hartwell, and the moment broke. Sebastian watched them depart, conscious of an unfamiliar sensation, the desire to continue a conversation that had barely begun. The following afternoon found him at his club, attempting to concentrate on correspondence from his steward. Philip appeared uninvited, settling into the chair opposite with the casual presumption of family. "You were quite taken with Miss Ashworth last evening," Philip observed. "I was polite to a guest of Lady Pemberton's. There is a distinction. You spoke with her for nearly 20 minutes. I timed it. You have not spoken to any woman for longer than 5 minutes in 3 years. Sebastian set down his pen with deliberate care. "Your fascination with my social habits is concerning, Philip. Your lack of social habits is what concerns me, and everyone else who cares for you." Philip leaned forward, his expression unusually serious. "You have been half alive since your parents died, Sebastian. You manage the estates. Brilliantly you sit in the Lords. You do everything a marquess should do, but you do not live. You exist, there is a difference." "This conversation is concluded," Sebastian said coldly, but Philip, emboldened by genuine affection, pressed on. "Miss Ashworth is not like the others. She is not hunting for a title or a fortune. She has known loss as you have. Perhaps nothing." Sebastian stood abruptly. "You overstep, cousin." He left the club without another word, stepping into the grey afternoon with a mind in turmoil. The presumption of Philip's observations rankled precisely because they contained truth he had no wish to acknowledge. He had indeed been merely existing, moving through his days with mechanical efficiency, feeling nothing deeply because to feel was to risk the annihilating grief that had destroyed his father. And yet, Miss Ashworth's words echoed in his thoughts. There is a certain safety in distance, is there not? Perhaps. But what if Philip was right? What if safety was another word for slow suffocation? 3 days later, he encountered her again at a musicale hosted by the Duchess of Somerset. Sebastian had attended only because his presence was politically advantageous, and he had planned to leave after the first interval. But when he entered the music room and saw Eleanor Ashworth seated near the window, her attention fixed on the string quartet with an expression of such transported concentration that she seemed entirely unaware of her surroundings, he found himself taking a seat at the back of the room. He did not listen to the music. He watched her. She sat very still, her hands folded in her lap, but there was nothing rigid in her posture. She seemed rather to be drinking in the sound, her lips slightly parted, her eyes distant. When the final movement of the Mozart concluded, she did not applaud immediately as the others did. Instead, she remained motionless for several heartbeats, as though reluctant to return to the present moment. Sebastian understood that reluctance. During the interval, he approached her deliberately. She stood alone by the window, looking out over the torchlit garden, and did not turn at his approach. "Do you always lose yourself so completely in music, Miss Ashworth?" he asked quietly. She glanced at him, surprise evident in her expression. followed by something more guarded. "Lord Thornbury, I did not realize you were in attendance. I arrived late." He stood beside her, careful to maintain proper distance. "You did not answer my question." Eleanor was silent for a moment, her gaze returning to the darkened garden. "Music was one of the few comforts during my father's illness. There was a small chapel near our villa where a choir practiced each Thursday evening. I would sit outside and listen. It made the difficult days bearable." The simplicity of her confession moved him more than any elaborate declaration. He found himself speaking before caution could intervene. "After my mother died, I could not bear to hear music for 2 years. My father kept the pianoforte covered. Eventually, I forced myself to attend concerts, believing that if I could train myself to endure it, I might train myself to endure anything." "And did you?" she asked, turning to face him fully. "Learn to endure anything?" "I learned to feel nothing," he replied, which is not quite the same thing. The words hung between them, more intimate than he had intended. Eleanor's grey eyes searched his face, and he had the unsettling sensation that she saw past the carefully constructed facade he presented to the world. "Feeling nothing must be a lonely existence, Lord Thornbury," she said at last, "less painful than the alternative. Perhaps, or perhaps it is a different kind of pain, one that accumulates so gradually we do not notice until we have become strangers to ourselves." Before Sebastian could respond, they were interrupted by the hostess announcing the resumption of the performance. Eleanor excused herself with a polite curtsy and returned to her seat. He did not follow immediately. Instead, he stood by the window, his reflection ghostly in the darkened glass, wondering when he had last felt as exposed as he had in those few minutes of conversation. The realization that followed was both unwelcome and undeniable. He wanted to see her again, not from duty or courtesy, but from genuine desire for her company. It was the first time in more than a decade that he had wanted anything beyond the efficient management of his responsibilities, and it terrified him entirely. Sebastian spent the following week in a state of uncharacteristic agitation. He attended functions he would normally have avoided, always with the half-acknowledged hope of encountering Miss Ashworth. When he did not see her, he felt an irritation he could not justify. When he learned from Philip that she had declined several invitations, preferring to remain at Lady Pemberton's townhouse, he experienced something dangerously close to disappointment. "She is not like the other young women," Philip reported over brandy in Sebastian's study. "Lady Pemberton says she spends most of her time reading or walking in the park. She has no interest in the marriage market." "Why are you reporting on her activities as though I have inquired?" Sebastian demanded, though he listened with undivided attention. Philip smiled knowingly. "Because you wish to inquire but are too proud to ask. You presume too much." "I presume accurately." Sebastian dismissed his cousin with irritation that barely concealed gratitude. Alone, he stood at the window overlooking his London garden, wrestling with impulses he had long ago trained himself to suppress. The sensible course was to forget Miss Eleanor Ashworth entirely. She had made clear her lack of interest in matrimony. He had built his life around emotional detachment. They were, by any rational measure, entirely unsuited to disturb each. Others carefully maintained solitude. Yet rationality, he was discovering, held little sway against the memory of grey eyes that saw too much, or a voice that spoke of loneliness as though it were a language they both understood. The decision, when it came, felt inevitable despite his resistance. He would call upon Lady Pemberton, ostensibly to discuss a charity patronage they both supported. If Miss Ashworth happened to be present, propriety would require polite conversation. Nothing more. Complicated than that. He despised the transparency of his own rationalization, but he went nonetheless. Lady Pemberton received him with barely concealed delight, her shrewd eyes lighting with matchmaking calculation that Sebastian chose to ignore. "Lord Thornbury, what an unexpected pleasure. Do come through to the drawing-room. Miss Ashworth is just finishing her correspondence, but I am certain she will join us shortly." Sebastian's pulse quickened, a physiological response he found, profoundly annoying. He took the seat offered, declined tea, and endured Lady Pemberton's pleasant inquiries about his estates with admirable patience. When Eleanor finally appeared in the doorway, something in his chest constricted. She wore a simple morning dress of pale blue, her dark hair arranged without artifice, and there was a smudge of ink on her right hand that suggested she had been writing in haste. She paused upon seeing him, surprise evident in her expression. "Lord Thornbury," she said, her voice carefully neutral. "I was not aware we were expecting visitors." "Lord Thornbury has come to discuss the orphanage committee," Lady Pemberton said smoothly, "and I have just remembered, how unfortunate, that I must speak with my housekeeper immediately about tonight's dinner. You will entertain Lord Thornbury until I return, will you not, my dear?" The maneuver was executed with such transparent cunning that Sebastian half expected Eleanor to object. Instead, she simply inclined her head and took a seat with the resigned air of one accustomed to Lady Pemberton's machinations. Silence settled between them, not entirely comfortable. "I apologize for the intrusion," Sebastian said finally. "Lady Pemberton exaggerated the urgency of committee business." "She means well," Eleanor replied, though her tone suggested she found her hostess's efforts as uncomfortable as he did. "You need not remain if you have other engagements." "I have nowhere else I wish to be." The admission emerged before he could censor it. Eleanor looked at him with that disconcerting directness, and he found himself continuing despite every instinct that warned him to retreat. "I have thought about our conversation at the musicale," he said. "Your observation about becoming strangers to ourselves. It was presumptuous of me to speak so personally to someone I barely know. It was honest. I find I prefer honesty to the elaborate courtesies that pass for conversation in most drawing rooms." Eleanor's expression softened slightly. "Then we are in agreement on that, at least." "Tell me about your father," Sebastian said, surprising himself, "if the subject is not too painful." She was quiet for a long moment, her gaze turning toward the window. When she spoke, her voice carried the weight of carefully managed grief. "He was a good man, a kind man, but broken by my mother's death. We were very close, she and I. When she died of fever 7 years ago, something in him simply ceased. He continued in his diplomatic duties, but the joy had gone out of him. The posting to Italy was meant to be restorative, but I think he knew, even then, that he was simply finding a more pleasant place to finish dying." Sebastian recognized the contours of that particular devastation. "You stayed with him, nursed him. I could not have done otherwise. He was all I had left." She turned back to him, and he saw the fierce pride in her expression. "I do not regret it, but there were days, many, days when I felt I was watching him choose grief over life, and I could not understand why love should necessitate such complete surrender to despair. My father made the same choice," Sebastian said quietly. "After my mother and the child died, I was 21, newly titled, entirely unprepared. He lived another year in body, but his spirit had already departed. He simply stopped eating, stopped sleeping properly, stopped caring about the estates or his remaining family. The physician called it melancholia. I called it cowardice." The harshness of his own words startled him. He had never spoken of his father's death so bluntly to anyone. Eleanor did not flinch. "Not cowardice, perhaps. Some people are not built to survive the loss of their other half. It does not make them weak, merely differently constituted, but it is terribly hard on those left behind." "You understand," Sebastian said, and it was not a question. "I understand what it is to watch someone you love choose death over the difficulty of continuing. I understand the anger that comes with that understanding. And I understand the decision to never allow yourself to be so vulnerable that loss could destroy you as it destroyed them." They looked at each other across the elegant drawing room, and Sebastian felt the walls he had spent years constructing tremble dangerously. Here was someone who knew, truly knew, the calculus of protection he had performed, the exchange of feeling for survival. "Is that why you refuse to marry?" he asked. "Because you have seen what love costs." "I refuse to marry because I refuse to lose myself," Eleanor replied. "I watched my mother define herself entirely through my father, and when she died, he had no self left to sustain him. I will not make that error. I prefer my independence to the illusion of romantic completion. A rational position. And yours, I suspect." Sebastian inclined his head in acknowledgement. "I have no intention of marrying. My cousin will inherit when I die. The succession is secure." "Then we understand each other perfectly," Eleanor said. There was relief in her voice, but also something else, something that sounded almost like disappointment. "We need not pretend otherwise." "No," Sebastian agreed. "We need not pretend." Yet even as he spoke, he felt the inadequacy of the words, because what he wanted, he realized with dawning alarm, was precisely to pretend, to imagine that the connection forming between them might be permitted to grow into something more than philosophical agreement about the dangers of attachment. Lady Pemberton returned with convenient timing, ending the interview before Sebastian could say anything further. He took his leave with impeccable courtesy, aware that Eleanor watched him go with an expression he could not interpret. Over the following days, Sebastian found himself unable to dismiss their conversation from his thoughts. He attended to his correspondence with unusual carelessness, approved his steward's recommendations without proper scrutiny, and caught himself staring out of windows with the abstraction of a much younger man. Philip observed these developments with poorly concealed amusement. "You are thinking of her constantly," he said one evening over dinner at Sebastian's Berkeley Square residence. "I am considering the philosophical implications of our discussion," Sebastian corrected. "You are falling in love with her. Do not be absurd. We have established a mutual understanding based on shared experience and compatible views on matrimony. Nothing more. Sebastian, I have known you since childhood. You have never been interested in any woman's views on matrimony. You have never sought out anyone's company merely for conversation. You are falling in love, and it terrifies you because it contradicts everything you have told yourself about how you must live in order to survive." Sebastian set down his fork with controlled precision. "Your amateur psychologizing is tedious, Philip. My accurate observation is uncomfortable, you mean." They finished the meal in tense silence. But later, alone in his study with a glass of whiskey he did not drink, Sebastian confronted the truth he had been evading. Philip was correct. Every instinct Sebastian possessed warned him to retreat, to restore the safe distance that had protected him for so long. Yet he could not stop himself from hoping he might encounter Eleanor again, from seeking any excuse to be where she might be, from reliving each word they had exchanged as though mining for hidden meaning. It was happening despite his resistance, despite his best efforts at self-preservation. He was beginning to care, genuinely, dangerously care, about a woman who had made abundantly clear that she valued her independence above all else. The irony was not lost on him. He had finally met someone who understood his determination never to be vulnerable to love's devastation, and that very understanding had begun to undermine his defenses. The following week brought an invitation to a garden party at Richmond. Sebastian would ordinarily have declined such frivolous entertainments, but when Philip mentioned that Lady Pemberton and her guests had accepted, he found himself agreeing to attend. The afternoon was unseasonably warm, the gardens at Richmond House sprawling and beautiful. Sebastian moved through the crowds with practiced ease, exchanging pleasantries whilst scanning for a particular dark-haired figure in pale muslin. He found her at last near the river, standing alone and watching the water with that same absorbed concentration he had observed at the musicale. She had removed her gloves, and her bare hands rested on the stone balustrade, a small impropriety that suggested she believed herself unobserved. Sebastian approached quietly, not wishing to startle her. When he spoke, his voice was low. "You have escaped the party." Eleanor turned, and for just an instant before her customary composure reasserted itself, he saw something unguarded in her expression. Pleasure, perhaps, or relief. "Lord Thornbury, I did not expect to see you here. I am as surprised as you are. Garden parties are not generally to my taste, nor mine." She smiled slightly. "Yet here we both are." "Here we both are," he echoed, moving to stand beside her. The proximity felt both natural and charged with significance. "You were deep in thought." "I was remembering the Arno, the river in Florence. I would walk along it in the evenings when my father slept. There was a particular bridge where street musicians played. I never gave them coins. I could not afford to. But I would listen until the sun set entirely." She paused. "I found I missed it when we returned to England. The freedom of being unknown, I suppose, of being simply another figure in a foreign city. You do not find that freedom here. In London? Hardly. Everyone watches everyone else. Every action is subject to interpretation and judgment. Sometimes I feel I can scarcely breathe for the weight of propriety. Sebastian understood that suffocation intimately. Yet you returned, when you might have remained in Italy after your father's death. I returned because I had nowhere else to go. The villa was rented. My father's income ceased. And because, despite everything, England is home, even when it feels like a cage. The melancholy in her voice moved him profoundly. Without thinking, he reached out and covered her hand with his own, where it rested on the stone. The touch lasted only a moment before propriety reasserted itself, and both withdrew simultaneously. But in that brief contact, Sebastian felt a current of connection so intense it left him shaken. Eleanor had paled slightly, her breath catching. When she spoke, her voice was carefully controlled. "Lord Thornbury, I apologize," he said quickly. "That was inappropriate." "Yes, it was," but she did not move away. We should not. I know." He forced himself to step back, to restore proper distance. "Forgive me." They stood in uncomfortable silence, the moment stretching unbearably. Finally, Eleanor spoke, her words chosen with evident care. "We agreed, did we not, that we understood each other, that neither of us sought romantic entanglement?" "We did. Then we must maintain that agreement, for both our sakes." She looked at him directly. "I will not be the instrument of your destruction, Lord Thornbury, nor will I allow you to be mine." The finality in her tone should have brought relief. Instead, Sebastian felt only a hollow ache that intensified when Eleanor excused herself with brittle courtesy and returned to the main party. He remained by the river, watching the water flow past with inexorable persistence, and acknowledged what he had been denying even to himself. It was already too late for mere agreement or rational understanding. He was falling in love with Eleanor Ashworth, and she was absolutely correct. It would destroy them both if he allowed it to continue. Sebastian's resolution to avoid further contact with Eleanor lasted precisely 4 days. On the 5th day, he attended a reception at the French ambassador's residence with the specific intention of not seeking her out, only to find himself watching the entrance with barely concealed anticipation. When she arrived with Lady Pemberton, dressed in deep rose silk that brought unexpected warmth to her complexion, something in his chest tightened painfully. He watched her move through the receiving line, observed the graceful way she conversed with the ambassador in flawless French, and felt a possessive pride entirely at odds with his determination to maintain distance. Their eyes met across the crowded room. For a moment neither looked away. Then Eleanor deliberately turned her attention to her companion, and Sebastian felt the snub as acutely as a physical blow. "She is avoiding you," Philip observed, appearing at his elbow with champagne and unwelcome commentary. "How extraordinary, given how assiduously you sought her company these past weeks." "I have not sought her company. You attended a garden party, Sebastian." "A garden party? You loathe garden parties with the passion of 1,000 suns." "The embassy functions are politically necessary," Sebastian said coldly, watching as Eleanor laughed at something the ambassador said. The sound carried across the room, genuine, unguarded, and it struck him that he had never made her laugh like that. "Of course," Philip agreed, his tone suggesting he believed nothing of the sort. "And I suppose it is mere coincidence that Lord Ashford has been paying marked attention to Miss Ashworth this past week." Sebastian's attention snapped back to his cousin. "What are you talking about?" "Ashford, Viscount Ashford, quite wealthy, excellent reputation, appropriate age. He was widowed 2 years ago. No children, unfortunately, but his estate is considerable. He has been calling on Lady Pemberton almost daily. Sent flowers twice this week alone." Every word landed like a blade. Sebastian forced his expression to remain neutral, even as fury, irrational, unwelcome fury, coiled in his chest. "Miss Ashworth's suitors are no concern of mine." "No? Then you will not mind that he is approaching her now?" Sebastian did mind. He minded with an intensity that alarmed him. Across the room, a fair-haired man in his early 40s had indeed approached Eleanor and Lady Pemberton. He was handsome in a conventional way, his manner apparently charming, and when he bowed over Eleanor's hand with particular attention, Sebastian felt something dark and primitive surge within him. "If you will excuse me," he said tersely. He crossed the room with deliberate purpose, aware that Philip followed with barely suppressed amusement. When he reached Eleanor's side, her expression registered surprise, followed by something that looked almost like wariness. "Lord Thornbury," Lady Pemberton said with obvious pleasure. "How delightful. May I present Viscount Ashford? Lord Ashford, this is the Marquess of Thornbury." Ashford bowed with easy courtesy. "Thornbury, of course. Your reputation precedes you. I understand your work in the Lords has been exemplary." "You are too kind," Sebastian replied automatically, his attention fixed on Eleanor. "Miss Ashworth, I trust you are well." "Quite well, thank you." Her tone was coolly formal, offering no encouragement. Sebastian felt the distance between them as an almost physical barrier, and hated that Ashford's presence seemed to have caused it. "Lord Ashford was just telling us about his estate in Derbyshire," Lady Pemberton interjected. "The gardens sound quite magnificent." "They are my late wife's legacy," Ashford said, his expression taking on appropriate solemnity. "She devoted the last years of her life to their design. I confess I maintain them now primarily in her memory, though I find I have developed a genuine appreciation for horticulture." "How lovely," Eleanor said softly, "to have something so beautiful to remember her by." The gentle sympathy in her voice twisted something inside Sebastian. She had never spoken to him with such warmth, only ever with careful guardedness, as though she feared what might happen if she allowed herself to be undefended in his presence. "I would be honored if you might visit them sometime, Miss Ashworth," Ashford continued. "Lady Pemberton as well, naturally. Perhaps a small house party next month. The roses will be at their peak." "How generous," Lady Pemberton said, beaming. "We should be delighted, should we not, Eleanor?" Eleanor hesitated, her gaze flickering briefly to Sebastian before returning to Ashford. "You are very kind, Lord Ashford. I shall give it serious consideration. I could ask for nothing more." Ashford smiled at her with transparent admiration. "You must allow me the honor of the next dance." "Miss Ashworth, unless of course you are already engaged." "I am not," Eleanor replied, placing her hand on his offered arm. Sebastian watched them move toward the dance floor with carefully controlled rage. Every instinct demanded he intervene, that he assert some claim to her attention. But he had no claim. He had nothing but their shared understanding that love was too dangerous to permit, and his own catastrophic failure to honor that understanding. "Well," Philip said quietly beside him. "That was illuminating. Be silent. You are in love with her, and she is going to marry Ashford if you do not do something to prevent it. She will do as she pleases, as is her right. Sebastian, I said be silent." He left the reception shortly thereafter, unable to bear watching Eleanor dance with another man, smile at another man's conversation, accept another man's attentions with apparent pleasure. The drive back to Berkeley Square passed in a blur of self-recrimination and impotent fury. In his study, Sebastian poured whiskey with an unsteady hand and stood before the portrait of his mother that hung above the mantelpiece. She had been beautiful, dark-haired like Eleanor, with eyes that held both intelligence and kindness. His father had worshipped her with a devotion that had ultimately destroyed him. "I will not," Sebastian said aloud to the painted face. "I will not allow myself to become what he became." But even as he spoke, he knew the declaration rang hollow. These tea. Damage was already done. He had allowed himself to care, and now jealousy ate at him with corrosive force, poisoning any peace he might have claimed through rational detachment. The following days brought fresh torment. London society, with its insatiable appetite for gossip, buzzed with news of Ashford's courtship. He was seen driving with Eleanor in Hyde Park. He sent her books, expensive volumes on Italian art that demonstrated he had listened to her interests and sought to please her. He attended every function where she might appear, and his attentions were marked, persistent and apparently welcome. Sebastian forced himself to attend these same functions, driven by masochistic compulsion to witness what he had lost, before truly possessing it. He watched Ashford make Eleanor laugh, saw him lean close to speak privately, observed the easy comfort that developed between them. "He is perfect for her," Philip said bluntly one evening at their club. "Wealthy, kind, genuinely interested in her happiness. He will not attempt to possess her or constrain her independence. If she wishes to continue her studies, travel, maintain her cottage in Kent, Ashford will support it all. He wants a companion, not a possession. Then she should accept him, Sebastian said, each word costing him. She should, but she hesitates. Sebastian looked up sharply. What do you mean? Lady Pemberton confided in my mother, who of course told me, Eleanor has not agreed to the house party in Derbyshire. She has not encouraged his courtship beyond basic courtesy. She is uncertain. Hope and dread ward within him. Perhaps she simply requires time. Or perhaps she is waiting for someone else to declare himself. Sebastian stood abruptly. Do not presume to understand her thoughts. I presume nothing, but I observe. And what I observe is two people determined to deny what is perfectly obvious to everyone else, that you are in love with each other, and too frightened to admit it. You overstep, Philip. Someone must. You are throwing away the possibility of genuine happiness because you fear becoming your father. But you are not your father, Sebastian. You are stronger, more resilient, more... Enough. Sebastian's voice cracked with suppressed emotion. I will hear no more of this. He left the club and walked through the London streets for hours, heedless of propriety or safety. The night air did nothing to cool the fever in his blood, the desperate confusion of wanting Eleanor with an intensity that terrified him, whilst simultaneously fearing that to pursue her would be to invite inevitable catastrophe. By the time he returned to Berkeley Square in the small hours of morning, he had reached no resolution. He was simply exhausted, of fighting his feelings, of watching another man court the woman he loved, of pretending he did not care when caring was all he seemed capable of anymore. The breaking point came at the Hastings ball 3 nights later. Sebastian attended with grim determination, knowing Eleanor would be present, knowing Ashford would monopolize her attention as he had at every recent gathering. He stationed himself at the edge of the ballroom. A glass of champagne he did not drink, held loosely in one hand, and waited. When Eleanor arrived, she was radiant in midnight blue silk, her hair arranged with artful simplicity, her bearing confident. Ashford claimed her for the first dance before she had been in the room 5 minutes, and Sebastian watched them take the floor with carefully controlled anguish. They moved together with comfortable coordination, Ashford's hand resting appropriately at her waist, Eleanor's expression pleasant but unreadable. When the dance concluded, he did not release her immediately, but instead leaned close to murmur something that made her smile, tentatively, but genuinely. Sebastian's control fractured. He crossed the ballroom without conscious decision, moving with single-minded purpose, until he stood before them. Ashford looked up with mild surprise, Eleanor with something closer to alarm. Miss Ashworth, Sebastian said, his voice strained, might I request the honor of the next dance? Silence fell around them, several nearby conversations ceasing as attention focused on the unprecedented sight of the Marquess of Thornbury actively seeking a dance partner. Eleanor hesitated visibly. Lord Ashford has requested the next set. Then the one following, Sebastian pressed, aware he was behaving with shocking impropriety and unable to stop himself. Please. The single word held more emotion than any elaborate declaration. Eleanor's grey eyes met his, and he saw conflict there, reluctance, confusion, and something else that looked almost like longing. Very well, she said quietly. The waltz, then. Ashford's expression had cooled considerably, though his manner remained polite. I shall return Miss Ashworth to Lady Pemberton's care until then, Thornbury. Sebastian inclined his head in acknowledgement, aware he had just made an enemy of a perfectly decent man, whose only fault was wanting the same woman Sebastian wanted. The intervening dance passed with agonizing slowness. Sebastian remained at the edge of the room, his attention fixed on Eleanor where she sat with Lady Pemberton. She did not look in his direction, but something in her posture suggested awareness of his scrutiny. When the waltz finally began, he approached with a sense of inevitability. Eleanor rose without protest, placing her gloved hand in his, and allowed him to lead her onto the floor. The moment his hand settled at her waist, something shifted between them. They had never been this close, never touched beyond that single brief contact at Richmond, and the intimacy of the dance position felt almost unbearably charged. You should not have asked me to dance, Eleanor said as they began to move. People will talk. Let them talk. Lord Ashford will be offended. Let him be offended. Sebastian looked down at her, drinking in every detail of her face. I could not bear to watch you with him any longer. Eleanor's step faltered slightly. Sebastian, the use of his Christian name, unguarded and intimate, went through him like lightning. Eleanor, he replied, her name a prayer on his lips. Tell me you feel nothing. Tell me these weeks of dancing attendance on Ashford mean you have chosen him, and I will step aside. But if there is any doubt, any hesitation in your heart, then please give me the chance to— To what? She interrupted, her voice low but intense. To break my heart? To teach me precisely why I swore never to allow myself to be vulnerable to this kind of feeling? I would never— You would not intend to. But intention is irrelevant. You have made clear your determination never to marry, never to allow anyone close enough to threaten your carefully maintained control. What are you offering me, Sebastian? What can you offer beyond this impossible attraction that will lead nowhere? Her words struck with devastating accuracy. Sebastian had no answer, only the impossible truth that he loved her and had no idea how to love her safely, how to love her without becoming his father, consumed by devotion and vulnerable to annihilating grief. I do not know, he admitted, the confession costing him dearly. I know only that watching you with Ashford is agony, that the thought of you accepting his courtship makes me want to— He stopped, struggling for control. Eleanor, I cannot offer you certainty, I cannot promise I will not fail you, but I also cannot stand silently by whilst you choose someone else when you what? The ballroom seemed to fall away. They moved through the waltz mechanically, whilst the world narrowed to the space between them, to the grey eyes searching his face with an expression caught between hope and fear. When I love you, Sebastian said finally, the words torn from somewhere deep and long buried. God help me, Eleanor, I love you. Her breath caught audibly. For a moment she said nothing, simply stared at him with an expression he could not interpret. Then, quietly, You should not. I know. This will end badly. I know that too. Then why? Because I am tired, Sebastian said roughly, of safety that feels like suffocation. Because you are the only person who has ever truly understood the cage I built around myself, and because somewhere in these impossible weeks you became the only person I want to let inside it. Even knowing, especially knowing how dangerous that is. The waltz was ending. Around them, couples began to separate, the spell of music breaking. But Sebastian and Eleanor remained motionless, locked in a moment that felt simultaneously eternal and heartbreakingly fragile. Lord Ashford expects an answer to his invitation, Eleanor said at last, her voice barely audible. I have put him off as long as propriety allows. Then, give him his answer. And what would you have me say? Sebastian released her slowly, aware they were attracting notice, that they had stood too long in the dance's conclusion. I cannot tell you what to choose, Eleanor, but I can tell you that if you choose him, you will be choosing safety, and if you choose me— He paused, meeting her eyes with painful honesty. If you choose me, you will be choosing risk, the risk that I will fail you, disappoint you, prove unable to overcome the fears that have governed me for so long, but also the risk that together we might discover something worth the danger. He bowed formally and walked away before she could respond, before his composure could shatter entirely in the middle of the Hastings ballroom. Behind him, he felt rather than saw Eleanor stand frozen on the dance floor, her world clearly as upended as his own. It was done. The careful distance they had maintained lay in ruins, and whatever came next would determine whether the risk they had both feared taking would prove justified, or would confirm every terrible lesson their losses had taught them about the price of loving too deeply. The morning after the Hastings ball brought no clarity, only a profound sense of having crossed a threshold from which there could be no return. Sebastian had not slept. He sat in his study, watching dawn break over Berkeley Square, replaying the previous evening's encounter with obsessive precision, torturing himself with Eleanor's every expression, every word. You should not, she had said, but she had not said, I do not love you. The distinction felt simultaneously crucial and meaningless. By noon, half of London knew that the notoriously detached Marquess of Thornbury had publicly declared himself, if not explicitly, then certainly implicitly, interested in Miss Eleanor Ashworth. The other half would know by evening. Sebastian received 3 notes before luncheon. one from his great-aunt demanding explanation, one from Philip, congratulating him on his courage, and one from Lord Ashford requesting a private interview at the Earl's earliest convenience. The last made Sebastian's jaw tighten. He sent word that he would call at Ashford's residence that afternoon. The interview, when it occurred, proceeded with painful civility. Ashford received him in a study appointed with restrained elegance, offered excellent brandy, and came directly to the point. "I will not pretend ignorance of your interest in Miss Ashworth," Ashford began, his manner courteous but firm. "Last evening's display made your feelings abundantly clear." "I apologize for any offense," Sebastian replied, though the words cost him. "It was not my intention to interfere with your courtship." "Was it not?" Ashford regarded him steadily. "Forgive my bluntness, Thornbury, but you have shown Miss Ashworth marked attention for weeks, whilst simultaneously maintaining that you have no interest in matrimony. Now, at the moment when she appears, inclined to consider my suit favourably, you suddenly declare yourself. It seems rather convenient timing." The accusation, delivered without heat but with undeniable logic, struck home. "You believe I seek to prevent her happiness with you out of mere possessiveness?" "I believe," Ashford said carefully, "that you care for her more than you are prepared to admit, even to yourself. I also believe you have no intention of actually offering her marriage, security, or any legitimate claim to your affection beyond temporary fascination. Am I mistaken?" Sebastian wanted to deny it. He wanted to declare that his feelings ran far deeper than fascination, that his intentions were entirely honourable. But the words died in his throat because Ashford was essentially correct. Sebastian loved Eleanor, but love and marriage were not synonymous, particularly not when marriage meant vulnerability to the kind of devastation that had destroyed his father. "I have no present plans to marry anyone," Sebastian said finally. "Then you do Miss Ashworth a grave disservice by encouraging her affection whilst refusing to offer any genuine future." Ashford's expression held more pity than anger. "I lost my wife to consumption 3 years ago. I understand grief, Thornbury. I understand the fear of loving again. But I also understand that life lived in fear is barely life at all. Your philosophical observations are noted. This is not philosophy, it is practicality. Miss Ashworth deserves a husband who can give her security, companionship and freedom to pursue her interests. I can offer her all of those things. What can you offer her beyond beautiful sentiments and emotional turmoil?" The question cut deeply because Sebastian had no adequate answer. What could he offer? Love, certainly, but love unaccompanied by commitment, by willingness to truly merge his life with hers, by capacity to overcome the terror that intimacy inspired. "I came here intending to withdraw gracefully," Sebastian said at last, "to acknowledge that you are the better man and that Eleanor's happiness would be best served by accepting your courtship." "Intending to, perhaps. But will you?" Sebastian met the other man's gaze directly. "If Eleanor chooses you, I will not interfere. But I cannot, will not, make her choice for her by removing myself before she has decided." Ashford nodded slowly. "Then we understand each other. May the better man win, Thornbury, though I suspect we both know which of us that is." Sebastian left the interview feeling hollowed out and uncertain. Ashford was right. He was the better choice by any rational measure. And yet the thought of Eleanor in another man's arms, bearing another man's name, building a life Sebastian had no part in, it was intolerable. He spent the afternoon riding in Hyde Park with deliberate visibility, aware that London society would be watching for signs of his next move. He acknowledged acquaintances with cool courtesy, deflected questions about Miss Ashworth with practiced ease, and projected an air of complete composure that bore no relation to the chaos within. When he returned to Berkeley Square, he found Eleanor waiting in his drawing-room. The shock of seeing her there, uninvited, unchaperoned, in flagrant disregard of propriety, rendered him momentarily speechless. She stood by the window, her back to the door, her posture rigid with what he recognized as barely contained emotion. "Miss Ashworth," he said finally, closing the door with deliberate care. "This is improper," she finished, turning to face him. "Yes, I am aware. Lady Pemberton believes I am calling on her dressmaker. I have perhaps 30 minutes before my absence is noted, and scandal becomes inevitable." Her face was pale, her grey eyes brilliant with something that looked like anger. Sebastian felt his pulse quicken, even as dread settled in his stomach. "Why are you here?" "To demand an explanation." Eleanor crossed the room with swift, controlled movements. "You declared yourself last evening in front of half the ton. You made promises with your eyes and your words that suggested—" She stopped, visibly struggling for composure. "And then I learned from Lady Pemberton, who heard from Lord Ashford's sister, that you called upon him this afternoon, that you told him you have no intention of marrying. So I ask you, Lord Thornbury, what precisely were you offering me last night, if not matrimony?" Sebastian felt the trap close around him. "I offered you honesty. I offered you the truth of my feelings. Feelings without commitment are not an offer, they are a burden." Her voice shook with fury now, all her careful control dissolving. "Did you think I would be flattered by your love if it came with no promise, no future, no intention beyond your own satisfaction? Did you imagine I would accept the role of, what, your mistress? Your secret passion, whilst you continue to declare publicly that you will never marry? No, Eleanor, I would never suggest—" "Then what? What did you think would happen after you forced me to acknowledge this impossible attraction between us? That we would simply continue as we have been, dancing around each other at balls, whilst you watch me consider other men's proposals, torturing ourselves whilst offering nothing real? I thought—" Sebastian stopped, recognizing the fundamental weakness of his position. "I thought honesty was preferable to deception." "Honesty?" Eleanor laughed bitterly. "You want credit for honesty? Very well, I love you, Sebastian. I have loved you almost from the moment we met, and I have fought that feeling with every rational particle of my being because I recognized immediately that you are precisely the kind of man who could destroy me. And last night you confirmed my worst fears by declaring your love while simultaneously making clear that love changes nothing, that you will not, cannot, offer me anything real. The words should have brought joy. Instead, they brought only anguish. Eleanor, Lord Ashford has asked me to marry him," she continued, her voice now deadly calm. "He made a formal proposal this morning, before your interview with him. He offers me security, companionship, and complete freedom to live as I choose. He does not love me as you claim to love me, but he respects me. He will not break my heart, because he will never possess it fully enough to break it. Do you love him? That is irrelevant. It is the only relevant question." Sebastian closed the distance between them, grasping her shoulders with barely controlled desperation. "Eleanor, do you love him?" "I could learn to," she said, though tears now streaked her face. "I could learn to be content with his affection, to appreciate his steadiness, to build a life that would be pleasant if not passionate. It would be enough. It would be a lie. And what alternative do you offer? What life can we build when you refuse to commit to anything beyond? The feeling of this moment, when the thought of actual marriage, of vulnerability, of trusting someone completely, terrifies you so profoundly you cannot even contemplate it." Her words struck at the heart of his cowardice, and Sebastian felt something break inside him. She was right. He loved her desperately, but love without the courage to act upon it was worse than useless. It was actively destructive. "I cannot become my father," he said, the admission torn from his deepest fear. "I cannot love someone so completely that their loss would annihilate me. I watched him die by inches after my mother's death, and I swore I would never risk genuine happiness, because you might someday experience genuine grief." Eleanor pulled away from his grasp, her expression now more sad than angry. "That is not protection, Sebastian. That is cowardice dressed as pragmatism." "Perhaps it is," he acknowledged, the words bitter. "But it is all I have. It is the only way I have survived." "Then we have nothing more to say to each other." Eleanor moved toward the door with terrible finality. "I came here hoping you would prove me wrong, that you would declare some genuine intention beyond beautiful words. But you have confirmed precisely what I feared, that you want my love without earning the risk that love requires." "Eleanor, wait. I am going to accept Lord Ashford's proposal," she said, her hand on the door handle. "He deserves an answer, and I have kept him waiting long enough. Do not do this." Sebastian heard the desperation in his own voice and hated it. "Do not marry him when you love me." "Why not?" She turned to face him one final time, and the devastation in her expression shattered what remained of his composure. "Give me one reason, one legitimate reason, why I should refuse a good man's honorable proposal in favor of a marquess who loves me but will not marry me, who wants me but cannot truly have me, who offers everything except the only thing that matters. Commitment despite fear." Sebastian opened his mouth to respond, and found he had no answer, no reason beyond his own selfish desire to keep her in his life, even as he refused her any secure place in it. "I thought not," Eleanor said quietly. She opened the door, paused, and spoke without turning. "I loved you, Sebastian. I wish that had been enough for you. But love without courage is simply another form of abandonment." She left, the door closing behind her with the soft finality of an ending. Sebastian stood frozen in the center of his drawing room, his world tilting sickeningly. She was right, about everything. He had behaved abominably, declaring his feelings whilst refusing to back them with any meaningful action, demanding she acknowledge their mutual attraction whilst offering nothing in return, disrupting her careful emotional protection without being willing to risk his own. He had acted from fear disguised as principle, and in doing so, he had driven away the only person who had ever truly understood him. The realization brought him to his knees, literally. Sebastian sank onto the settee, his head in his hands, and confronted the catastrophic truth. He had lost her. Not to Ashford, but to his own insufferable pride, his paralyzing terror of vulnerability, his determination to love without ever truly giving himself. And the worst part, the absolutely unbearable part, was that she deserved better. She deserved Ashford's uncomplicated devotion, his willingness to offer everything she needed without reservation. She deserved a man brave enough to match her courage with his own. Sebastian was not that man. He had proven it definitively this afternoon. And now Eleanor would marry someone else, and he would spend the rest of his life knowing he had held happiness in his grasp and let it slip away, because he was too much a coward to seize it. Evening fell over Berkeley Square, and Sebastian remained motionless, watching the light fade whilst something equally essential dimmed within him. By morning all of London would know. Miss Eleanor Ashworth had accepted Viscount Ashford's proposal. The engagement would be announced within days. The wedding would follow with appropriate speed, and Sebastian, Marquess of Thornbury, would return to the cold comfort of the life he had chosen, safe, controlled, and utterly empty of everything that made existence worth enduring. He had gotten exactly what he claimed to want: protection from vulnerability, freedom from the risk of devastating loss, safety from the kind of love that could destroy him. He had gotten everything except Eleanor, and that, he was discovering far too late, was the only thing that had ever truly mattered. The announcement appeared in the Morning Chronicle 3 days later. Viscount Ashford and Miss Eleanor Ashworth are pleased to announce their engagement. The wedding will take place at St. George's, Hanover Square, on the 15th of July. Sebastian read the notice whilst taking breakfast, the words blurring before his eyes. 6 weeks. He had 6 weeks before Eleanor became irrevocably another man's wife, before the possibility of changing course disappeared entirely. 6 weeks that might as well have been 6 hours for all the good they would do him. He had not seen Eleanor since their catastrophic interview. Lady Pemberton had sent a coldly formal note informing him that Miss Ashworth was no longer receiving visitors except family and Lord Ashford. The snub was deliberate, comprehensive, and entirely deserved. London society buzzed with speculation. The Marquess of Thornbury's unprecedented public display of interest, followed so swiftly by Miss Ashworth's engagement to another man, made for delicious gossip. Some whispered that Sebastian had proposed and been rejected. Others suggested Eleanor had only accepted Ashford to spite Thornbury's pride. A few, more perceptive or better informed, understood that the truth was more complex and more tragic. 2. People who loved each other but could not overcome their respective fears had chosen safety over risk and would spend the rest of their lives regretting it. Sebastian withdrew from society entirely. He declined invitations, ceased attending the Lords, and spent his days managing estate business with mechanical efficiency, whilst his evenings dissolved into sleepless nights haunted by memories of grey eyes and quiet understanding. Philip called repeatedly and was repeatedly turned away. Finally, he simply arrived at Berkeley Square and refused to leave until Sebastian agreed to see him. "You look appalling," Philip said bluntly when admitted to the study. "When did you last sleep or eat properly?" "I am perfectly well." "You are a liar and an idiot." Philip poured them both whiskey despite the early hour. "You love her. She loves you. And yet you are allowing her to marry someone else out of sheer stubborn terror. She deserves better than what I can offer. She deserves better than Ashford's tepid affection when she loves you with genuine passion." Philip slammed his glass down with uncharacteristic violence. "For God's sake, Sebastian, you are not your father. You are stronger, more resilient." "Am I?" Sebastian interrupted, his voice raw. "How can you possibly know that? How can anyone know until they are tested? My father was strong too, until my mother died. Then he simply ceased, stopped living in any meaningful sense. I watched it happen day by day, and I swore I would never allow myself to be so vulnerable that another person's loss could annihilate me." "But you are already vulnerable." Philip leaned forward intently. "You are suffering now, profoundly suffering, because you love Eleanor and cannot have her. Your precious protection has failed entirely. The only question is whether you will suffer for refusing to risk love, or whether you will have the courage to suffer for attempting it. At least the latter offers some chance of happiness." The logic was sound, but Sebastian felt paralyzed by a terror so profound it overrode reason. What if I marry her and then lose her? What if she dies in childbirth or from fever or in any of the 1,000 ways women die? What if I become my father, so consumed by grief that I am useless to everyone, including any children we might have? How is that fair to her, to potential heirs? "What if you do not?" Philip countered. "What if you marry her and live 50 years together? What if you have children who grow strong and healthy? What if every day you share is worth whatever eventual pain parting brings?" He paused, his expression gentling. "Sebastian, you cannot protect yourself from grief by refusing to live. All you accomplish is ensuring that your suffering begins now instead of later, and that you experience it entirely alone instead of with someone who loves you." Sebastian turned away, unable to meet his cousin's eyes. "She is engaged to Ashford. She has made her choice." "She made that choice because you forced her to, because you declared your love while simultaneously making clear you would not act upon it. You gave her no alternative except to accept a man who at least offers her security and respect, even if he cannot offer her passion. Perhaps security and respect are enough. For some people, perhaps, but not for Eleanor, and not for you." Philip stood, placing a hand on Sebastian's shoulder. "You have 6 weeks to decide whether you will spend the rest of your life wondering what if, or whether you will find the courage to fight for what you actually want. I suggest you use them wisely." After Philip left, Sebastian remained in his study, wrestling with impossible questions. He poured another whiskey he did not drink and stood before his mother's portrait, searching the painted face for guidance. "What would you tell me to do?" he asked aloud, feeling foolish but desperate. "Would you say love is worth the risk, or would you warn me away, knowing what your death cost, father? Cost all of us?" The portrait naturally offered no answer, but as Sebastian studied his mother's gentle expression, he found himself remembering things he had deliberately forgotten, how she had laughed, filling their home with warmth and joy, how she had faced her final pregnancy with courage, despite knowing the risks, how she had chosen to love his father completely, without reservation, even though that love had ultimately demanded the highest price. She had been brave. His father, for all his later weakness, had been brave in loving her so absolutely, and Sebastian, in his determination to avoid their fate, had become something worse than weak or destroyed. He had become half alive, exactly as Philip had once accused, a ghost moving through his existence without truly inhabiting it, protected from grief but also from joy, from connection, from every experience that made life worth living. Eleanor had seen that truth immediately. There is a certain safety in distance, is there not? She had observed at their first substantive conversation. She had understood because she had made the same calculation, chosen the same protective isolation, until they had met each other and discovered that isolation could be breached, that safety could be surrendered, that two people determined to avoid vulnerability might nonetheless find themselves utterly exposed to one another. The question was whether that exposure was devastation or revelation. Sebastian spent the following week in a torment of indecision. He drafted a dozen letters to Eleanor and burned them all. He walked past Lady Pemberton's townhouse repeatedly, hoping for a glimpse of her, hating himself for the pathetic gesture. He attended a dinner where Ashford and Eleanor were present and watched them interact with cordial affection that suggested contentment, if not passion. She looked well. That was what destroyed him most completely. She looked composed, even happy, as Ashford attended to her with solicitous care. She smiled at his conversation, accepted his attentions with apparent pleasure, and gave every indication of a woman satisfied with her choice. Perhaps Philip was wrong. Perhaps Eleanor did not love him as desperately as he loved her. Perhaps she had already moved past their brief, intense connection and found genuine happiness in the safer harbor of Ashford's regard. The thought should have brought relief. Instead, it intensified Sebastian's misery to unbearable levels. 3 weeks before the scheduled wedding, Sebastian received an unexpected visitor, Lady Pemberton herself. She arrived without prior notice, was announced into his drawing room with impressive authority, and fixed him with a look of such stern disapproval that he felt like a schoolboy caught in some mischief. "Lord Thornbury," she said without preamble, "we must speak plainly. I am at your disposal, your ladyship. Do not toy with me, young man. I have known you since you were in leading strings, and I am far too old for diplomatic niceties." She settled herself on the settee with the air of one preparing for battle. "You are in love with Eleanor Ashworth. She is in love with you, and yet she is preparing to marry Lord Ashford in less than a month. This situation is intolerable." Sebastian felt heat rise in his face. "Miss Ashworth has made her choice. I respect—" "You respect nothing except your own fear," Lady Pemberton interrupted sharply. "I have watched you. These past months, Sebastian. I have watched Eleanor as well. I am not blind to what passes between you, nor am I ignorant of the reasons you both resist it. But I am here to tell you that cowardice dressed as principle is still cowardice, and I will not stand by whilst two people I care for deeply destroy their chances of happiness out of stubborn pride. Your ladyship, I appreciate your concern, but—" "She cries herself to sleep every night," Lady Pemberton said bluntly. "Did you know that? The household staff hear her. She maintains perfect composure during the day, discusses wedding arrangements with admirable efficiency, and accepts Lord Ashford's attentions with appropriate gratitude. But at night, when she believes herself alone, she weeps. For you, Sebastian. She weeps for you." The revelation struck like a physical blow. Sebastian sank into the nearest chair, his carefully maintained composure finally crumbling. "She should not. She has chosen a good man who will give her everything I cannot, except the one thing she actually wants, you." Lady Pemberton leaned forward, her expression softening with compassion. "Lord Ashford is indeed a good man. He will be a considerate husband, a reliable partner, but Eleanor does not love him, and he knows it. He is proceeding with the marriage because he believes quite reasonably that you will not offer any alternative. I cannot. Can you not? Or will you not?" When Sebastian did not immediately respond, she continued, with devastating precision. "Your father's death was tragedy, Sebastian, but you are not your father. You are a different man, in different circumstances, with different strengths. To predicate your entire existence on the assumption that you are doomed to repeat his experience is not wisdom. It is abdication of responsibility to your own life. You do not understand. I understand perfectly. I understand that love requires courage, and that courage is frightening. I understand that every marriage carries risk of eventual loss. But I also understand that refusing to live because you might someday grieve is the greatest waste of a life I can imagine." She stood, preparing to depart. "Eleanor is marrying Lord Ashford in 3 weeks. If you intend to intervene, do so soon. If you do not, then at least have the decency to leave London, so she need not endure your presence at the wedding whilst her heart breaks." She left without waiting for his response, the door closing with finality. That echoed through the empty room. Sebastian sat motionless for a long time, Lady Pemberton's words reverberating in his mind. "She cries herself to sleep every night." The image of Eleanor, composed, controlled Eleanor, weeping alone in the darkness, shattered something fundamental in his chest. He had told himself she would be happy with Ashford, that her apparent contentment was genuine, that his sacrifice of his own happiness was justified by ensuring hers. But if she was suffering as he was, suffering, if her composed exterior masked the same anguish that consumed him, then his noble self-denial was not protection, but mutual destruction. For the first time since Eleanor had left his drawing room, Sebastian allowed himself to truly consider the alternative. What if he went to her? What if he declared himself properly, offered her everything she deserved, marriage, commitment, his whole heart without reservation? The thought terrified him more than anything he had ever contemplated. But it also, for the first time in weeks, offered something that felt like hope. That evening, Sebastian sat at his desk with paper and pen, attempting to articulate thoughts that felt too large and chaotic for language. The letter went through countless iterations, each one failing to capture the complexity of his feelings, the depth of his regret, the desperate love that had only intensified during their separation. Finally, in the small hours of morning, he wrote simply, "Eleanor, I have spent these weeks trying to convince myself that your happiness with Ashford justifies my cowardice. Lady Pemberton has disabused me of that comfortable fiction. I love you. I have loved you from the moment you spoke of safety and distance, because I recognized in you the same fear that has governed my life. I have loved you through every conversation, every stolen glance, every impossible moment when we both acknowledged what we felt, while simultaneously denying its significance. I was wrong to declare that love whilst refusing to act upon it. I was wrong to demand your acknowledgement of our connection, whilst offering no future in which that connection might develop. I was wrong about nearly everything except the fundamental truth, that you are the only person who has ever made me want to risk the vulnerability I have spent my adult life avoiding. I cannot promise I will not fail you. I cannot promise the grief I fear will never come. But I can promise that if you will give me another chance, if you will break your engagement to Ashford and marry me instead, I will spend every day we have proving that love, even with all its attendant dangers, is worth the courage it requires. I am asking you to take an enormous risk on a man who has given you little reason to trust him. I am asking you to believe that I have changed, that I am capable of the commitment I previously refused. I am asking you to forgive my terrible failure and trust that I will not fail you again. If you can find it in yourself to give me this chance, I will be waiting in the garden at Richmond House tomorrow at noon. If you cannot, I will understand, and will trouble you no further. Yours, in hope and terror, Sebastian." He sent the letter by private messenger at first light, with instructions it be delivered directly into Miss Ashworth's hands and no one else's. Then he waited, the hours until noon dragging past with excruciating slowness, his entire future balanced on a knife's edge of Eleanor's decision. Noon found Sebastian standing in the gardens at Richmond House, the same location where they had first touched, where he had first allowed himself to acknowledge the depth of his feelings. The day was overcast, heavy clouds threatening rain, the air thick with unseasonable humidity. He had been there since 11, unable to remain at Berkeley Square a moment longer, pacing the gravel paths with barely controlled agitation. Every sound made him start, every footstep, potentially Eleanor's, every rustle of leaves possibly heralding her arrival or her rejection. Noon came and passed, 1:15, 1:30. Sebastian felt hope drain away with each passing minute. She was not coming. Of course she was not coming. He had behaved abominably, declared his inadequacy in the clearest possible terms, and she had wisely chosen to proceed with her engagement to a man who had proven his worth rather than gamble on one who had proven only his cowardice. He was turning to leave, accepting defeat with numb resignation when he heard her voice. "You came." Sebastian spun around. Eleanor stood at the entrance to the garden path, her appearance suggesting she had arrived in considerable haste. Her hair was slightly disheveled, her gown creased, and her eyes were red-rimmed in a way that suggested recent tears. She had never looked more beautiful. "You came," he echoed, his voice rough with emotion. I thought, I received your letter." Eleanor moved closer, though she maintained careful distance between them. Lady Pemberton intercepted it, read it herself, and then gave it to me with the observation that if I did not at least hear what you had to say, I was as much a coward as you had been. She is a formidable woman. She is. Eleanor's expression was guarded, her posture defensive. You wrote that you love me, that you want to marry me, that you have changed. All of that is true. Is it? She searched his face with an intensity that made him feel utterly exposed. Or have you simply realized you cannot bear to lose me to another man? There is a difference, Sebastian, between genuine transformation and possessive desperation. The accusation, delivered with devastating accuracy, forced Sebastian to confront his own motivations with brutal honesty. Was he here because he had genuinely overcome his fears, or simply because watching Eleanor with Ashford had proven intolerable? I do not know, he admitted. Finally, I cannot untangle my motives cleanly enough to present them to you with confidence. I know only that these weeks without you have been the most miserable of my life, that learning you cry yourself to sleep broke something in me I did not know could break, that the thought of you marrying Ashford whilst loving me, if you still love me, is unbearable not just for my sake, but for yours. Words, Sebastian. You spoke beautiful words before, and they meant nothing because you refused to act upon them. Then do not listen to my words. Demand actions. He closed the distance between them in 3 swift strides, taking her hands in his, despite her instinctive movement to withdraw. Tell me what you need from me to believe this is real. Tell me what proof you require that I'm capable of the commitment I claim to fear so profoundly. Eleanor stared at their joined hands, her breath coming quickly. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely audible. I need to know that you will not change your mind, that you will not wake up in 6 months or 6 years and realize that your fear was justified, that you cannot bear the vulnerability that marriage demands, that you regret the choice you made today. I cannot promise immunity from fear, Sebastian said quietly. Fear may always be part of loving deeply, but I can promise that I will not allow fear to govern my actions, as I have allowed it to govern them these past months. I can promise that when I am afraid, and I will be afraid sometimes, I will tell you honestly rather than retreating into cold detachment. I can promise that I will try every day to be worthy of the trust you place in me. Pretty promises. Then watch me keep them. He released one of her hands to pull a small velvet box from his coat pocket. This was my mother's. She wore it the day she married my father, a pendant of sapphires and diamonds that matched her eyes. My father gave it to me after she died, saying I should give it to the woman. I loved when I finally found the courage to admit I was capable of love. He opened the box to reveal a delicate pendant, the stones catching what little light penetrated the heavy clouds. Eleanor's breath caught. It has been locked in my safe for 11 years, Sebastian continued. I never imagined I would remove it. Never thought I would find anyone who could make me want to risk what my father risked. But you did. You made me want impossible things, connection, vulnerability, a future that extends beyond efficient management of estates and responsibilities. Sebastian, I am asking you to marry me, Eleanor, properly, with witnesses and bans and every traditional marker of serious intent. I am asking you to break your engagement to Ashford, to endure the scandal and social censure that will follow, to trust that I will not prove the disaster you fear. He paused, his voice dropping to urgent intimacy. I am asking you to choose risk over safety, passion over contentment, a flawed man who loves you desperately over a good man who respects you adequately. Tears streaked Eleanor's face now, her composure finally shattering. This is impossible. You are asking me to gamble everything on a man who has already proven unreliable. I am asking you to gamble on us, on the possibility that 2 people who understand fear intimately might be uniquely positioned to help each other overcome it. Sebastian cupped her face gently, his thumbs brushing away her tears. I am, terrified, Eleanor. Absolutely terrified of what loving you means, of the vulnerability it demands. But I am more terrified of living without you, of spending the rest of my life knowing I let fear win, that I chose empty safety over the chance, however uncertain, of genuine happiness. If I accept, Eleanor whispered, and you fail me, if you retreat into that cold detachment you showed me at the beginning, it will destroy me, completely. I know. The trust you are asking for is enormous. I know that too. I have already sent acceptances for the wedding invitations, already begun assembling my trousseau, already—" her voice broke. "Already started trying to convince myself I could learn to love Lord Ashford as I love you, and failing utterly at that particular deception." Hope surged through Sebastian with painful intensity. "Then do not try. Break the engagement. Marry me instead. It will cause terrible scandal. Let it. Lord Ashford will be humiliated. He will recover. He deserves a wife who loves him fully, which you cannot be whilst loving me." Eleanor pulled back slightly, creating space between them, her expression torn. "I need you to understand something, Sebastian. If I do this, if I break my engagement and accept your proposal, there is no possibility of retreat. I will not forgive a second failure. I will not accept beautiful declarations that prove empty. You will have one chance with me, and if you squander it, we are finished. Permanently." Ultimatum delivered with absolute sincerity should have terrified him. Instead, Sebastian felt only fierce determination. "One chance is all I ask. One chance to prove that I am capable of the courage that love requires. You will have to speak with Lord Ashford, apologize properly for interfering with his courtship, accept responsibility for the pain this will cause him. I will do so today. You will have to endure society's censure. There will be those who call you heartless, who suggest, 'You corrupted an engaged woman. Let them say whatever they wish. None of it matters if you are beside me.'" Eleanor was silent for a long moment, her grey eyes searching his face with an intensity that felt like physical touch. Sebastian held himself very still, barely breathing, his entire future balanced on whatever conclusion she reached. Finally she spoke, her voice steady despite the tears that continued to fall. "Give me the pendant." Sebastian's hands shook as he removed the necklace. From its velvet nest, he moved behind Eleanor, lifting her hair gently, and fastened the delicate clasp at her nape. The sapphires settled against her throat, brilliant even in the grey light, and something in Sebastian's chest expanded painfully. When Eleanor turned to face him, she was wearing his mother's pendant, a declaration more powerful than any words could be. "I am choosing to trust you," she said quietly. "Not because you have earned that trust, but because the alternative, marrying Lord Ashford whilst loving you, is a slow death I cannot bear to contemplate. But Sebastian, hear me clearly. You must be equally brave. You must tell me when you are afraid. You must not retreat into silence and detachment when intimacy becomes difficult. You must promise that you will try, genuinely try, to build a life with me, rather than merely existing alongside me." "I promise," Sebastian said, the words a vow. "I promise to try, every day, to be the husband you deserve. I do not need you to be perfect. I need you to be present. Can you do that?" "I can. I will." He pulled her into his arms, feeling her resistance melt as she finally allowed herself to accept his embrace. "God, Eleanor, I thought I had lost you." "You very nearly did." She pressed her face against his chest, her voice muffled. "If Lady Pemberton had not told me you were suffering as I was, if I had believed your composure at that dinner last week was genuine rather than performance, I might not have come today. Then I owe her a debt I can never repay." They stood entwined in the garden as the threatened rain finally began to fall, light at first, and then with increasing intensity. Neither moved to seek shelter. The rain felt purifying, washing away the weeks of misery and misunderstanding, leaving only the elemental truth of two people who had found each other despite every rational reason they should not have. "We must speak with Lord Ashford immediately," Eleanor said eventually, though she made no move to leave his arms. "And Lady Pemberton, and secure a special license so we can marry quickly before I lose my courage." "I will handle Ashford and the license. You speak with Lady Pemberton." Sebastian drew back enough to look down at her, drinking in every detail of her rain-soaked face. "And Eleanor, thank you for giving me this chance, for being braver than I was, for choosing risk when safety would have been so much simpler." "Safety is overrated," she replied, a tremulous smile finally. "Breaking through, and infinitely lonely. Then we will be lonely together no more." The interview with Lord Ashford, conducted that evening in the Viscount's study, proceeded exactly as painfully as Sebastian had anticipated. Ashford listened to Sebastian's halting explanation with controlled fury, his normally pleasant features tight with anger. "You are asking me to release Miss Ashworth from her engagement 3 weeks before our wedding," Ashford said, when Sebastian had finished speaking, "to endure the social humiliation of being jilted for a marquis who has treated her abominably. And you expect me to do this gracefully?" "I expect nothing," Sebastian replied honestly. "I am asking, begging for your understanding. Eleanor loves me, not you. Marrying her under those circumstances would be a disservice to you both." "I am aware she loves you," Ashford said coldly. "I have been aware since I first began courting her. I believed foolishly, apparently, that given time and proper treatment, she might come to love me as well, or at least to find contentment in our marriage. You deserve a wife who loves you completely, from the beginning, without reservation. And what do I tell society? That I was so inadequate a suitor that my fiancé preferred a man who publicly declared his unwillingness to marry anyone." The barb struck home. Sebastian absorbed it without flinching. "Tell them the truth, that circumstances changed, that Miss Ashworth and I discovered feelings neither of us anticipated, and that you released her from her commitment with grace and understanding. Your dignity in this situation will be remembered far longer than the temporary scandal." Ashford was silent for a long moment. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a mixture of resignation and bitter humor. "I suppose I should take comfort in the fact that at least one of us will be happy. Though I confess happiness achieved at my expense gives me no satisfaction whatsoever. I know. And I am profoundly sorry." "Are you? Or are you simply profoundly relieved?" Ashford stood, moving to pour them both brandy with hands that shook slightly. "Thornbury, I do not like you. I respect you less, but I recognize that Eleanor has made her choice, and forcing her to honor her commitment to me when her heart belongs to you would be cruel to us both." He handed Sebastian a glass, his expression weary. "You have your release. Use it well, and if you ever hurt her the way you have hurt her these past months, I will ensure you regret it, thoroughly. Understood? Now get out of my house before I change my mind and call you out for your presumption." Sebastian left quickly, aware he had gotten off far more easily than he deserved. The special license was secured within 2 days. Lady Pemberton, once convinced of Sebastian's sincerity, threw herself into preparations with characteristic efficiency. The wedding would take place at her private chapel, with only immediate family and closest friends in attendance, a deliberate counter to the grand society wedding that had been planned with Ashford. The week before, the ceremony passed in a blur of practical arrangements and emotional recalibration. Sebastian and Eleanor were rarely alone. Propriety and caution dictated careful chaperoning until after the wedding, but the few conversations they managed felt different from everything that had come before. More honest, more vulnerable, more real. 3 days before the wedding, Eleanor appeared at Berkeley Square with Lady Pemberton's reluctant permission for a private interview. Sebastian received her in his study, hyper-aware of her presence in his space, of the domestic intimacy the setting implied. "I spoke with my solicitor today," Eleanor said without preamble, "about settlements and arrangements. Whatever you wish is acceptable to me. You have not heard my terms yet." She moved to the window, her back to him, her posture defensive. "I wish to maintain my cottage in Kent, and my independence regarding my own income, small though it is. I am willing to take your name to fulfill the social obligations of a marchioness, to bear your children if that is your wish. But I need to know I retain some measure of autonomy, that I have not simply traded one form of constraint for another." Sebastian came to stand beside her, careful not to touch. "Eleanor, I have no intention of constraining you. Your cottage remains yours. Your income remains yours. Your time, your interests, your pursuits, all of those remain yours. I am asking you to share your life with me, not to surrender it." She turned to look at him, vulnerability stark in her expression. "I am still afraid. Even now, with the wedding just days away, I am terrified that I am making a catastrophic error." "So am I." The admission seemed to surprise her. "You are?" "Constantly. I wake each morning wondering if I have truly changed, or if I am simply more skilled at self-deception than I realized. I question whether I am capable of sustaining the emotional openness that marriage demands. I fear I will revert to old patterns of detachment and disappoint you profoundly." He took her hands carefully. But I am more afraid of not trying, of allowing fear to win again, of losing you when I have only just found you." Eleanor's eyes filled with tears. "We are a fine pair, are we not? Two terrified people gambling everything on the hope that together we might be braver than we are. Individually, is that not what marriage is? Mutual courage in the face of uncertainty?" "I suppose it is." She squeezed his hands. "Sebastian, if we do this, when we do this, promise me we will be honest with each other, about our fears, our doubts, our struggles. Promise me that even when it is difficult, even when vulnerability feels dangerous, we will tell each other the truth. I promise. On my mother's memory, on everything I hold sacred. I promise." They stood together in the afternoon, light, holding hands and drawing strength from physical connection, preparing themselves for the tremendous leap of faith that marriage represented. The wedding day arrived with appropriate drama, a thunderstorm that broke over London just as guests began arriving at Lady Pemberton's chapel. Sebastian stood at the altar, watching water cascade past the windows, and took the meteorological chaos as somehow fitting. Nothing about his courtship of Eleanor had been conventional or calm. Why should their wedding be any different? Philip stood beside him as groomsman, offering quiet support and the occasional steadying hand on Sebastian's shoulder when his cousin's nervousness became too evident. "Breathe," Philip murmured. "She will come. She loves you. What if she has reconsidered? What if she has realized?" "She will come," Philip repeated firmly. "Have faith." The chapel doors opened. Eleanor appeared on Lady Pemberton's arm. Her own father being dead, the older woman had insisted on giving her away, and Sebastian's breath caught. She wore cream silk simply cut, her dark hair arranged with white roses, and his mother's sapphire pendant at her throat. She looked terrified and radiant and absolutely beautiful. Their eyes met across the chapel. Eleanor's step faltered almost imperceptibly. For one heart-stopping moment, Sebastian feared she would turn and flee. Then she smiled, tentative, tremulous, but genuine, and continued forward. The ceremony passed in a blur. Sebastian heard himself make vows that felt simultaneously momentous and inadequate, felt Eleanor's hand tremble in his own, as she repeated words that bound them irrevocably together. When the vicar pronounced them man and wife, when Sebastian lifted Eleanor's veil to kiss her for the first time as his marchioness, he felt the full weight of what they had chosen: partnership, vulnerability, the terrifying and exhilarating commitment to face life's uncertainties together rather than in careful isolation. The wedding breakfast was intimate, the conversation carefully cheerful, the undercurrent of emotion running beneath every toast and well-wish. When it finally concluded and Sebastian and Eleanor departed for Thornbury House, his primary estate in Surrey, where they would spend their first weeks as a married couple, the relief was palpable. The journey passed in near silence, both of them exhausted by the emotional intensity of the day. When they finally arrived at Thornbury House as night fell, Sebastian handed Eleanor down from the carriage and felt the strangeness of the moment. This woman was now his wife, his marchioness, his partner in every sense, and he had absolutely no idea how to proceed. They were shown to the marchioness's rooms, chambers that had stood empty since his mother's death, now hastily prepared for Eleanor's arrival. The staff withdrew with appropriate discretion, leaving them alone together for the first time as husband and wife. Eleanor moved to the window, looking out over the darkened parkland. Sebastian remained by the door, suddenly paralyzed by uncertainty. "I realize," he said finally, "that we have rather reversed the traditional order of things. We married before properly courting, committed ourselves before fully understanding what we were committing to." An accurate observation. Eleanor turned to face him, her expression unreadable. "What do you suggest we do about it?" "I suggest—" Sebastian crossed the room slowly. "I suggest we begin again, properly. That we use these first weeks to learn each other without the pressure of society watching, without the weight of expectation or the shadow of past failures." He stopped before her, close but not touching. "I suggest we court each other, Eleanor, as we should have done from the beginning, if we had been braver sooner." "Court each other whilst married?" A smile played at her lips. "That seems backwards." Everything about us has been backwards. Why stop now? Lena laughed, the first genuine, unguarded laugh he had heard from her in weeks. The sound filled something hollow in Sebastian's chest. Very well, she said. Court me, Lord Thornbury. Prove to your wife that marrying you was not the catastrophic error she fears it might be. I will, Sebastian promised, every day for as long as we both shall live. He kissed her then, properly, deeply, with all the accumulated longing and fear and hope of the past months pouring into that single connection. When they finally broke apart, both breathless, Eleanor's grey eyes were bright with tears. I love you, she whispered. Despite everything, despite my best efforts, I love you desperately. I love you, Sebastian replied, the words coming more easily than they ever had before. And I will spend the rest of my life trying to be worthy of that love. Even when I fail, especially when I fail, I will try. They stood together in the Marchioness's chambers, newly wed and still uncertain, but no longer alone, in their uncertainty. Two people who had learned too young that love carried terrible risks had chosen, against every rational instinct, to risk it anyway. The sapphire pendant gleamed at Eleanor's throat in the candlelight, a symbol of promises kept and promises yet to be fulfilled. Sebastian touched it gently, remembering his mother, thinking of his father, and acknowledging the truth they had both learned through loss, that love was dangerous precisely because it was invaluable, that vulnerability was not weakness but courage, that safety purchased through isolation was no safety at all, but merely a slower form of dying. He had feared becoming his father, consumed by love, destroyed by loss, but standing here with Eleanor, feeling the weight and wonder of their new beginning, Sebastian understood at last that the greater danger had been refusing to love at all, that his father's devastation had not come from loving too much, but from having loved so truly that life without. That love became unbearable, and if Sebastian was fortunate, if he and Eleanor were both very brave, perhaps they would build something strong enough to weather whatever losses eventually came. Perhaps they would create a love that sustained rather than destroyed, that made them stronger individually by making them vulnerable together. It was a gamble, the greatest gamble of his life. But as Eleanor leaned into his embrace, as her arms wrapped around him with equal parts trust and fear, Sebastian knew he had finally made the right choice. He had chosen love over safety, connection over isolation, hope over resignation. He had chosen Eleanor. And that, he was beginning to understand, made all the difference.